Okay, so today we're going to begin our discussion on roots, go through some of the simple structures about roots and why they're so important with plants. So first of all, the functions of roots, two main functions. First is just to anchor the plant into the soil, provide stabilization so that when the wind blows, even when strong hurricanes or things blow through, many and if not most of the trees still remain standing because of the roots. The second one is to absorb water and minerals which are found in the soil, which can then be conducted up the plant to the different tissues of the plant. The root systems can be very large and extensive, especially in larger trees, and can even have a combined length of up to 650 kilometers, so if you put all the roots together. There are different types of roots, but the development of roots in a germinating seed comes from the radicle. And the radicle is the first part that grows out of the embryo, and then it develops into a root. And generally, that radicle will develop into the taproot, which is a big, thick part, and that would be on this side. And dicots typically have a big taproot, and then they have smaller roots kind of coming out from that. But most of their root is that big taproot. Whereas adventitious roots do not have a big taproot. Instead, the roots are actually derived from the stems or the leaves, and then they grow down. So the stem grows first, and then the leaf grows. The roots grow from the stems into the ground, and this is typical of monocots. Alright, so the structure of the root has four different parts, and this is from the very tip going up the root. So the very tip has a root cap, and there's a region of cell division, a part where those cells elongate in the region of elongation, and then where they mature into tissues in the region of maturation. So we'll talk about each of those individually. So we'll start with the root cap, which is made of parenchyma cells. The purpose of the root cap is to protect the delicate root tips from the rough and scratchy substrate in which it is moving through. So one of the ways they do that is they produce a lubricant, which is produced by the organelles, the dictyosomes that have lots of production of this lubricant. It allows growth through the soil, and then it also attracts bacteria, which are important for the function of the roots, including nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There is also evidence to show that the root cap also helps the roots grow in the right direction, which is down towards the gravitational pull. So the directional implementation of this is called gravitropism, or growing towards gravity or away from. And the way they figured that out is if you take the root cap off, the roots will start to grow in all directions. But when you put it back on, or when it grows back, then it starts to grow in the correct direction. So the second part is the region of cell division, and this is the apical meristem in the center of the root. So this is where most of the cell division is occurring. It doesn't occur at the same rate. In fact, the ones on the very end occur at a greater rate than the ones further inland or further in. These cells are generally large and cubical in shape, and there are three areas of growth occurring in this meristem. The protoderm, which is becoming the epidermis, the ground meristem, which is becoming the parenchyma of the cells of the cortex, or the inner part, or the procambium, which becomes the primary xylem and phloem. Then we have the third region, the region of elongation, and this is where the cells start to extend, and you can see that in these cells, how they're much longer than the previous one. They do become somewhat wider, but mostly grow in length. The reason they are allowed to, or what is responsible for most of this growth is the vacuoles become increasingly large, and they become 90% of the volume. Some secondary growth can occur if the cambium is present, but otherwise it remains stationary in its growth. The fourth region is the region of maturation, and this is where the cells are then differentiating into different tissues. This is also called the root hair zone because it generally has lots of root hairs if they are present. And here's a picture of some root hairs here. And root hairs are tubular extensions of epidermal cells. So they aren't a continuation like the root tip would be, where you have mitosis occurring. Instead, you just have extensions of the epidermis. And the cuticle on this is really thin to allow for absorption of water and minerals. But it greatly increases the surface area. The cortex is the parenchyma cells between the epidermis and the inner tissues, and this is mostly for food storage. And then the endodermis lies on the inner layer of the cortex. Okay, so you can see that this is the cortex. Here then is the endodermis. And the endodermis makes this region called the Casparian strip. It has lots of lignin in it, and what this allows it to do is to prevent water and nutrients from going in between the cells, and they have to go through the cells. And once it goes through the cells, then they can regulate what minerals, hormones, or other things traveling with the water can go through and which cannot. The vascular cylinder then lies inside the endodermis, and that's for conducting food and water. And the pericycle is the typically first layer inside the Casparian strip, made of parenchyma tissue, which becomes the lateral roots and part of the vascular cambium. The primary xylem and phloem then are structurally different in monocot and dicot roots. In dicots, they have a typical X pattern of the phloem, and then the xylem around them kind of fills in that area. And in monocots, they have the xylem and the phloem in a ring, which we don't have a picture of. In bundles, in rings, yeah. The vascular cambium develops then from the pericycle and other parenchyma cells to develop secondary xylem and phloem in concentric cylinders. So that's how it then grows outward from there. In woody plants, the cork cambium arises from the pericycle outside of the vascular cambium. That's only in the woody plants. All right, so those are the four different layers of the roots. Roots can be used for lots of different functions, and so some of them are very specialized, including food storage roots, where you're going to have lots of storage of sugars and starches. Water storage roots for when supply is inadequate. There's a picture of a water storage. So the actual plant looks kind of small, but the root structure is very big, and there's lots of water in there. This is, of course, going to be typical of plants in arid environments. You have propagative roots, which are adventitious buds that grow into suckers, then become individual plants. So this is another way of reproducing asexually. And then you may have pneumatophores, which are spongy roots that come out of the ground. This is generally found in plants that are aquatic or in water. Since there's not a lot of oxygen in the water, these roots will stick out into the air and be exposed to the oxygen there. Oops. Sorry. So water storage roots, propagative roots, and pneumatophores. I don't have propagative roots there. You may also have aerial roots, which would be an example here. These are roots that are exposed to the air. They may be for gathering water support, or some of them can photosynthesize. You have contractile roots, which are roots that can contract and pull the plant deeper and deeper into the soil so it can access more nutrients. Buttress roots, and that's what you have an example of here, which create these vertical walls basically to stabilize the tree or plant This is usually found where there are very shallow soils, so there's not a lot for the roots to dig into. There are also some parasitic roots which don't actually photosynthesize. Instead, what they do is they tap into, that's what we have here, tap into another plant's xylem and phloem and get energy from the plant that way. And the projections which do that are called hystoria. You should have learned about mycorrhizae in general biology, but these are fungal species of fungus that are in a mutualistic relationship with plants. What they do is they basically extend the roots so that they can get more water and nutrients, and then in return they provide sugars and nucleic acids for the fungus. There are two different types. Ectotrophic fungi form just a thin layer around the root, and then there's endotrophic fungi, which is what you have here, where the fungi actually infiltrate the different cells and go into the plant itself. Okay, you may also have root nodules, and this is specifically prevalent in the legumes or the family Fabaceae. This is your beans and other like plants. And what they have is these nodules form nitrogen-fixing relationships with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and they produce small swellings called nodules. And so the nitrogen-fixing bacteria then are able to provide nitrogen for the plant, which is necessary for making of proteins. All right, so the second part, we're going to talk about soils. Soils are, you just think of dirt and all dirt's the same, but it's not. It's actually very complex, dynamic, changing, depending on lots of different things which we'll go in. But within there contains, organic matter that is dead and decaying. It has animals living in there. It also has some sort of parent material or bedrock by which everything was originally established. And so soil composition is a combination of a lot of different things, including the climate, precipitation, the parent material, vegetation, things living in, and so forth. Some important things about soils include the sizes of the pores, or the spaces in between the different things in the soil. Large pores are generally filled with air, whereas small pores are generally filled with water. Now, if you took a cross-section of a soil, you would be able to see different profiles or different stages kind of within them. So the five we're going to go over are the O horizon, which is at the top, and that is has the most organic material in it. The A horizon, which has mineral matter mixed with some of the organic layer. The E horizon has some leaching occurring, so water comes through, kind of dissolves things, and brings it through that way. The B horizon, which is where you have accumulation of clays from the previous layer. And then the C horizon has the parent material with some mixing of the clay, some wearing of that parent material. And then you have unweathered parent material under that. So parent material can largely determine what the soil is going to be composed of. And there are three different types of rocks which parent material can be. It can be igneous rock, which is volcanic activity, so the formation of new rock. And generally, igneous rock is a very, very fertile soil from igneous rock, because all those minerals and stuff coming from the center of the core's earth provide many nutrients important for plant growth. You also have sedimentary rocks, which are rocks formed through the erosion of rock through wind, soil, or other things. And then metamorphic rocks, which are formed from sedimentary rocks that have been under extreme heat or pressure, or both, for millions of years. Climate, of course, affects the soil, and the climate is the patterns of average yearly temperatures and rainfall. Here we have a climate diagram. which has a lot of information on it, but mostly temperatures and precipitation is what greatly affects the soil. Soil is affected by how hot it gets, how the heat can cause the soil to crack and dry out. The cold can cause it to also crack through freezing and thawing. Precipitation can weather rocks and also cause erosion and cause it to be swept away that way. So lots of different ways climate can affect soil. Living organisms, of course, and what the organic composition is can affect the soil. This mostly occurs in the top 30 centimeters of soil. Then there's lots of different things which affect it. So bacteria and fungi decompose organic and dead material. Burrowing organisms such as earthworms will aerate the soil, and they can change, break things up and change the spatial dynamics within it. All these living organisms also will produce carbon dioxide, whether they are going through aerobic or anaerobic fermentation. And carbon dioxide will react with water to create carbonic acid, which then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. Okay, and so that can make the soil more acidic and affect the soil that way. Plant roots also affect the structure, break things up, can also take the water out of it, and sometimes affect the nitrogen composition of the soil as well. Topography, of course, affects erosion. If you have too steep of a topography or too flat with nowhere for the water to go, it can take a lot of that top soil off and cause erosion. Or if the area is too flat and there's no further the water go and it starts to form pools, then that can affect the nitrogen fixing ability of the things, the bacteria in the soil, and reduce productivity that way. So an ideal topography allows for drainage without erosion, and there are ways that humans have altered the hillsides to allow for the deposition and infiltration of water and some flow without causing erosion. So if this was just a flat hillside, all this water would just flow off of it and take all the soil with it. So soil is made of three different things: sand, silt, or clay. So let's say silt, sorry. And is a composite. The different mixes of those make up the different types of soil. Silt is microscopic particles. Sand is small particles which are bound together, but silt is then smaller than that. And then clay is increasingly smaller than silt and can't even be seen with some microscopes, which are very, very small. Clay forms these negatively charged micelles, which attract positively charged ions, so like magnesium and potassium. And then also it attracts water, and water will bind to these particles, which is a form of adhesion, and basically make something similar to a solution, which is called a colloid, which is particles suspended in water, but those particles are bigger than molecules, so it's not a solution. And the properties of water, of cohesion, are so strong that it can prevent evaporation and it can prevent the water from percolating through the soil. Loams are the best types for agricultural soils. You can see we got clay loam, medium loam, silty clay loam, sandy clay loam, different types of loams, but generally the best is 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. So if we got 40% sand, 40% silt, so you go up to here, and then 20% clay. I don't know where that puts us. 40, 20. So yeah, somewhere around here gets us a nice medium loam. Light soils are heavy on sand, which is the largest particles, and they're low on clay. Heavy soils have a lot of clay. They're very densely packed in. And then coarse soils have large particles that don't hold water, which isn't good. Clay soils are very high water content, but that water doesn't pass through, which also isn't good. So in order to have a healthy soil where organisms and plants can grow, it needs to be large enough to allow water in, and allow for air as well. So too small particles and you get, like over here where things get compacted, water fills in the spaces and no air can get in, and then water then prevents the nitrogen fixing process. Too large and water just passes through and there's too much air and causes it to dry, and the microorganisms also release their nitrogen, so there's no nitrogen fixation available. Alright, water of course affects the soil. There are three different types of water. Hygroscopic water, in reference to soil, which is physically bound to soil particles. These are so tightly bound to these soil particles that they are unavailable to the plants. Gravitational water is water that drains out of the pores after rain. The best type of water is capillary water, which is water held against the force of gravity in the pores of the soil, but is not physically bound to the soil particles. And plants, again, are dependent on that source for water. Soil pH, if things are too acidic or too basic, then it will affect the organisms living within it. Mycorrhizae don't do well in soils that are too acidic or too basic or alkaline. Alkaline soils will also reduce the availability of minerals such as copper, iron, and manganese, and acidic soils then inhibit the growth of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So to counteract this, some farmers will mix sulfur with alkaline soils to reduce the pH, and acidic soils will be mixed with calcium or magnesium to increase the pH, and that's called liming.